Hi, everyone. Welcome to Forbes Newsroom. I'm Diane Brady, and I'm here with Gordon Chang, who is a senior fellow at the Gatestone Institute. And also, Gordon, I know, of course, famously the author of The Coming Collapse of China. Welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much, Diane.
So I want to start with what to make of President Xi Jinping's response at this point. We've seen protests. Now we're seeing some easing of policies. How are you thinking about that?
It's really a very confusing situation in China right now. We had those extraordinary protests that followed the November 24th fire. Those protests are fascinating because they were not coordinated, there was no leadership, they were not organized, but they were countrywide, which indicates that people in China are thinking the same thing, and that means that they will react the same way, which means that probably we will see more protests in the future. Now, clearly, Xi Jinping, the Chinese ruler, got the message. They are now sending signal from Beijing to relax policy. But local officials are under an impossible situation because they're also told to make sure there are no more cases. So they've got two contradictory guidelines. I think what we're seeing, and this is, I think, a good development in a sense, and that is that local officials are experimenting. So even within the same municipality or city, you'll see many different policies. And eventually, one of two things will happen. Either a good policy will emerge nationwide, or there will continue to be confusion. But right now, this is one of the most interesting developments in policymaking in the world today.
Well, how unusual is it to have that level of local experimentation? And is it unusual under Xi, or has it been unusual for many years?
This really, to find something comparable, I think you'd have to go back to the early years of Deng Xiaoping, who was Mao Zedong's successor. Because Deng in 1978, at the famous Third Plenum, actually signaled that China would reform and open up. And there was no clear direction as to specifically what to do, but we saw experimentation all across China. And that was one of the most exciting periods in communist Chinese history. Well, we're seeing something similar now, although Xi Jinping does believe in totalitarian controls, but nonetheless, he's being forced to open up. And that is this dynamic between the Chinese people and the Communist Party, which really means, last month we heard everybody say, well, Xi Jinping has consolidated his control over the party. And yes, that was right, at least from the moment. But at the same time, we could also see that the party was losing control over Chinese society. And that was evident from these protests at the Apple iPhone plant in Zhengzhou, the Foxconn facility. And that really was an indication that there could be extraordinary developments, which in fact did occur after that fire.
Now, I know we've had protests in Hong Kong. We've certainly had protests, around Urumqi but how much of this it's explicitly tied to COVID? And if the restrictions are eased, is that going to, in your mind, address that just general discontent in the population, or is this a Pandora's box?
I think it's actually more than just COVID. Now, obviously, the COVID restrictions were the motivating factor because in that fire, it was clear that firefighters couldn't get to the building for some time because of the COVID blockades, and also because people were sealed into their apartments. So that is the motivating factor. But very quickly, Diane, we heard people go beyond just COVID and saying, down with Xi Jinping, down with the Communist Party. And that was a revolutionary sentiment. So there will be problems in the future because there will be incidents, maybe COVID related, maybe not, that will trigger protests. So China right now is in one of these very uncertain, very volatile situations where anything can happen.
We've seen actions by principally Apple, but other U.S. companies to try and move their supply chains out of China, or at least minimize their footprint there. How important is that right now?
I think it's absolutely critical for a company because you can't rely on China to be a reliable source of supply. You can't rely on the factory being able to produce. And even if the factory produces, the question is, can you get your product to port, which has become increasingly a major issue, and then onto a ship? So I'm not saying that companies won't be able to do it, but they cannot rely on that, which means they do need at least alternate sources of supply, because China is now, I think, not a good place to manufacture. I mean, the political risk is just enormous. And a couple other things. We got to remember that this is not just COVID protest. We have Xi Jinping reasserting totalitarian control over China generally. Mm-hmm. He believes in a state economy, which means he is undermining foreign and domestic Chinese private entrepreneurs. And in addition, he's also just trying to close China off. You know, periodically, Chinese rulers have done this when they felt that the pressures from the outside are too much for their system. So Xi Jinping has been doing that. And there's been a fair amount of xenophobia, which is really disturbing. So you put all that together, it makes China a very difficult place to manufacture, and certainly not a reliable platform anymore.
Given the importance of exports and the external market to China, it would seem counterintuitive that President Xi would be trying to cut off the country right now. What's the logic, given that the economic factors are certainly present in these protests as well?
I don't think that economic growth has ever really been a priority for Xi Jinping. The most important thing has been Communist Party control and orthodoxy. So I think that he has sort of felt a little bit arrogant. Remember, he is very much felt from the very beginning that the United States and the West in general is in terminal decline, and that China will rule the world. And if you come at the policy with that viewpoint, it means that you do press things and you do things which are not necessarily good for economic growth. So it's a very different mindset that Xi Jinping has. And it's very different from his immediate predecessors. It's certainly very different from Deng Xiaoping. Xi Jinping reveres Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong, with his power, that after he consolidated power, embarked on these impossible campaigns, the Great Leap Forward, Cultural Revolution. And in those campaigns, Communist Party control was the most important thing. So you start to look at this as a very different China than the one that we knew, let's say, 5 or 10 years ago.
So I think one of the big questions is always engagement. There's engagement at the business level, engagement at the state-to-state level, and with everything going on in Russia right now, what's the appropriate response?
I have never been in favor of engagement. I think the policy sounds great to the ear, appeals to the better instincts and the generous instincts of Americans, but we have seen that it has produced very dangerous results, put the United States in mortal danger. And so I believe that the United States, for various reasons, needs to disengage. China uses every point of contact to overwhelm the U.S., and they are trying to bring down our government. And we've seen that with them fomenting violence on American streets, something that they started to do in 2020 and have continued. So we need to cut those ties until we can be sure that we can manage relations with China and maintain a stability of our country. So my view is that a very different one than the business communities.
I don't want to make you start issuing grades, Gordon, but I am curious your thoughts as to the Biden administration right now, because the response has shifted somewhat. How are they managing this and handling it?
The Biden administration, and Biden personally, has believed in engagement. And I believe that his view of China is one that has been an old one and has been frozen in time. But nonetheless, the Chinese have done things which have forced him to do things that he probably would have never wanted to do. So, for instance, you take a look at his executive orders on chips and chip-making equipment, which I believe are great. I don't like the exemptions that he's given, the one-year exemptions to South Korea and to Taiwan. But nonetheless, this is a move in the right direction. And then, of course, I know that many people don't like industrial policy. It does lead to inefficiency. but the chip industrial policy that, to encourage chip making in the U.S., absolutely essential, not from an economic point of view, but from a national security point of view. So I think that those are moves in the right direction. Biden is stumbling to a better China policy, but it's largely because Xi Jinping is forcing him into adopting policies that he doesn't like. I think the president should go faster. I think he should go further. But nonetheless, the United States is moving in the right direction.
One last question, if you don't mind, Gordon, which is, I recall well when your book came out about the coming collapse of China, and have the conditions shifted to where this is now realistic? When you think about the various scenarios you've played out in your mind, what are some of the real pivot points that you think really mark a different way of thinking about this now?
Yeah, in 2001, I wrote The Coming Collapse of China, and I predicted that the Communist Party would fall within 10 years. So I think I'm probably out of time. In my defense, I will say that I did not foresee the 2008 downturn, which changed things. But what we're seeing today, Diane, I think is very much, it shows that the regime is unstable. And these protests are Exhibit A. But I think that the problem is, ultimately, fundamentally for the Communist Party, is the situation. People compare what happened over the last couple of weeks to 1989. But I don't think that's right. 1989, yes, there were nationwide protests, 370 cities, but the protesters they weren't calling for the Communist Party to step down. What they wanted was to get rid of a premier, Li Peng, who was a hardliner, and they wanted the party to open up. The situation, I think, that we see today is similar to 1949. In 1949, the communists, who were outgunned in every way by Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists, actually won. And they won because, as a famous Chinese historian, Yu Yongshi, has said, that the nationalists had lost people's hearts. And that's why they failed. And they failed in the face of a far inferior foe. And so that's the problem with the Communist Party today. They have lost people's hearts. They can coerce, they can intimidate, they can imprison, but they can't lead. And this means that ultimately they will fail because the Chinese people understand that the root cause of their problems in Chinese society is the Communist Party governance.
In a one-party state, what's the alternative? The example you cited was basically Chiang Kai-shek versus Mao Zedong. We don't have that bilateral situation now. If the party does fall, what do you predict happens then? Is it just an opening up and a new leadership?
Well, since I have such a great track record on predicting things, let me hazard one more. We just don't know. I mean, martial law would seem to be an interim solution. I think the Chinese people will struggle. Of course, as you point out very correctly, on the mainland, they don't have very much in the way of democratic precedents. They had a brief democratic opening in 1912 or so, which lasted a few months. So they don't have many precedents to fall back on, but they do have Taiwan. I mean, people in Taiwan don't consider themselves Chinese, but the people in the mainland consider them to be Chinese. And in Taiwan, regardless of self-identification, you have a vibrant democracy. And so that, I think, is the precedent. Plus, also, you got democracies along the periphery of China. Those are precedents as well.
Great. Thanks for joining us, Gordon.
Thank you so much, Diane.